So Thomas the Tank Engine is a thing. The show was basically my childhood. When I was young, my dad and I would go to the local library and borrow VHS tapes, and I would watch them on repeat until we had to give them back a week later, where I would pick up another tape and repeat the process all over again. The library only had like 3 tapes of Thomas the Tank Engine, so I watched all of them multiple times. I was like 4, so I had the memory of a goldfish. In order to get ready for this episode, I went back and watched some of the show, and not only was I super surprised by how much I remembered, including that theme song, which is fucking amazing and so infectious. And now that you've heard it again, you will be humming it for days. But also that the show was still ongoing, and it was old even when I was a child. There are like 1 million seasons and more than a few movies, with more coming out every few years. These new incarnations still have the same tone and feeling of the remote-controlled trains with puppeteered eyes and stop-motion pieces, but were fully voice-acted, which weirds me out. But as of this year, the original show was cancelled and completed its final season, which means there's no time like the present to get nostalgic over the death of a beloved childhood character. The television shows we grew up with as children have a huge effect on us, and we never forget those characters. Being in the age of reboots and revivals and living in a society that is obsessed with nostalgia, it's not surprising to see a resurgence of a lot of the children's shows that the millennial generation grew up with. Of course, we have the cult classics that have returned, like She-Ra and the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, although they never really left because that show gets rebooted like every 5 years or so. But even the preschool shows are coming back. There's a full-length Dora the Explorer movie, and Clifford the Big Red Dog is set to get his own feature. And don't even try to tell me that you didn't tear up a little when Steve posted that message for the 25th anniversary of Blue's Clues. I'm not crying, you're crying. And now Thomas is gone too? But the point of this video isn't to get emotional about childhood characters returning, although I could definitely do a video about that. What I'm more interested in is how these characters and shows teach us and socialize us. As I said, the biggest one for me was Thomas the Tank Engine, but a lot of children's shows have similar presentation in regards to the pedagogical approach to teaching children ethics, specifically when it comes to how children begin to grasp the rights and wrongs of society, how these shows present that morality, and how children understand the morality presented to them in kinder-age media. And so today, I want to talk about Thomas the Tank Engine. Thomas the Tank Engine was the original name for what is now referred to as Thomas and Friends. The show was an adaptation of a series of books titled The Railway Series by Reverend Wilbert Awdry, dating all the way back to 1945. The Railway Series featured anthropomorphic trains used to tell stories for children. The trains themselves were accurately based on real working trains from around Britain where Awdry lived. The setting of the island of Sodor acts as a loose stand-in for the British Isles in the show. The books were later adapted into a show called Thomas the Tank Engine in 1984 by the British writer and producer Britt Allcroft, who wrote and produced the show herself. The short 3 to 5 minute stories were a huge success and were presented as part of the spin-off show called Shining Time Station in the US 5 years later. From the very first episode in 1984 all the way up to 2021, there were a total of 24 seasons, or series for the Brits, and these were accompanied by 13 movies. In 2008, Thomas's production was switched over from the traditional models to computer animation, and finally this year the show completed its last season and aired its final episodes. But fear not! Mattel, who now owns the franchise, has rebooted the series into a fully 2D animated show called Thomas and Friends: All Engines Go. And I have to say, it's very strange to hear the characters talk on their own rather than be narrated by Ringo Starr of the Beatles.
He was just going to sleep when Thomas came up in his cheeky way.
Or, because I live in North America, George Carlin.
Shit, piss, fuck, cunt, cocksucker, motherfucker, and tits!
Yeah, that George Carlin. Bit of a tonal shift for him. I will say that I'm a fan of the art direction for All Engines Go, but I do prefer the charm of the original narrated storytelling and model trains. But that doesn't mean it's not really cool to see the characters I grew up with become meaningful to a new generation, even if they're missing out on that theme song.
I'm the #1 engine, whoa! All engines go!
It's just not the same. I'm only going to spoil the structure of the show, and it is a children's show, but people can be touchy about spoilers, so here's your spoiler warning for a 30-year-old show for preschool children. The original series consisted of the titular Thomas the Tank Engine and his fellow trains and vehicles transporting people or goods around the island of Sodor and occasionally getting into trouble because of their own silliness or indiscretion. Episodes usually center around 1 or 2 of the vehicles on the island, usually the trains, and then present that train with a moral quandary or underline a particular behavior or a less desirable character trait. The story would then play out with the engine getting into some kind of trouble, usually of their own making, and ending up off the rails where they're then scolded by the owner of the railway, the fat controller, Sir Topham Hatt, for causing mischief or for making part of the railway system run behind schedule or have to stop altogether. In the end, the train would learn their lesson and promise to be a good and useful engine until the next time they messed up. And of course, in early seasons, the whole thing, including the character voices, is told to the viewer by a single narrator. In the earlier seasons, the show did have continuity between episodes, meaning that new engines being introduced, jobs changing, and lessons learned were presented in a linear fashion, but it was never necessary to watch the episodes in order. The later seasons and movies do have much more complicated stories with actual character arcs and separate voice acting, but were essentially the same kind of morality plays as the early seasons. For the most part, what I'm talking about is aimed at the earlier seasons, since that's what I'm most familiar with, but I'm sure that my ideas will apply to the show as a whole and beyond to other early childhood media. And that is how Thomas the Tank Engine impresses its messages onto children. Let me know if you've heard this one before, but when you stop and take stock of Thomas the Tank Engine's world and society a bit more critically, you begin to see that this is actually a kind of nightmarish classist dystopia. Never mind that there's this weird dichotomy between the trains themselves and the other characters that drive the trains, which calls into question the notion of autonomy for the engines as independent beings. Yeah, let's put that aside, because I'm more interested in the way that the trains are treated by Sir Topham Hatt as this kind of totalitarian Marxist nightmare. The trains are constantly reminded and remind each other that they need to strive to be useful engines, and this refrain becomes a catchphrase for the show.
Sir Topham Hatt works his engines hard, but they are very proud when he calls them really useful.
When Sir Topham Hatt shows up to scold the trains for whatever reason, it's often because they're seen as being naughty or cheeky, and that has caused the railway to be less efficient, and therefore the train is not useful. And trains and vehicles that are not useful will be scrapped as literal junk. Because the trains are both objects and entities, the show plays with this line between the two, and we get the trains worrying about being scrapped if they're not able to keep up with their work. This effectively means that the usefulness of the engine is directly linked to the train's value, or in Marxist terms, the labor a train produces is a commodity that can be exploited, and it is the sole value of that being. They are exploitable and expendable entities that are seen only for their value as labor and can be discarded. Now, this is certainly one reading of the show, and I do think it's fun to examine the show in this way, but I don't want to say that the show is somehow implying some evil capitalistic message, or that the trains are oppressed and need to rise up. Both of these are absurd ideas for children's shows. The point of this societal structure in the show is to impart the social ideas of being respectful, kind, charitable, and hardworking individuals in a society. Audiences are supposed to sympathize with the trains, and it's easy to see when the trains make decisions based on foolishness or pride. When they're admonished by Sir Topham Hatt, it's usually because of this foolishness or pride, and it's warranted, and although sometimes he does talk of the trains being scrapped, it's not meant as a threat so much as just the blurry lines inherent in anthropomorphization. Is that a word? Anthropomorphization? The conceptual process of anthropomorphosis? You know, like the fact that they're not really people, they're trains? I'm gonna say that's a word. In children's shows that deal with communities, we often see a character that is an authoritative figure like Sir Topham Hatt, and that the morals and judgments placed on other characters is universal. This is because the socialization process of learning right and wrong is an important step in children's development. We spend a lot of time and energy in Western society and in Western media underlining the social mores or do's and don'ts of our society to our youth, and one of the hardest parts to navigate for toddlers is morality. And so, we wind up with these strange and oversimplified universes in Western media directed at preschool-age children because this helps impart the morals and socialization that they're still learning. These are not badly crafted universes by any means, but they're certainly not intended to be indicative of the real world when scrutinized with any depth, and the Marxist reading of the world of Thomas the Tank Engine is probably a bad faith analysis because the intention of the show's in-world community is to impart morals. But it is fun to use that lens to illustrate how the world is structured when it imparts these morals. The oversimplified worlds of children's shows is important, and generally these worlds have some sort of system in place that governs the citizens, which is almost always an authority figure that passes judgment on wrongdoers. In Thomas the Tank Engine, we have Sir Topham Hatt, the fat controller. This is important because according to research, children tend to think about the world in terms of moral objectivity. This is a fancy way of saying that the way one views morality is that there is a set of rules that are right and there is no other way. When children are young, the boundaries that are set for them, physically, socially, and morally, are given to them by their parents. In the eyes of the child, a parent or guardian, and later teacher or caretaker, is the authority figure, and their authority is where morals come from, and therefore moral objectivity seems perfectly reasonable. In the shows that are presented to children, we often see the same presence of an authority figure who supplies the morals for the characters in the show, and that's just the way the show's world works. When Sir Topham Hatt admonishes the trains, he literally owns them, so his word is the only morality that matters, and he is the authority figure and the allegory of the parent for the trains in the child's mind. The issue of ownership has more to do with that anthropomorphization that I was talking about, the train/people problem, so we'll leave that to the side and focus on the fact that the Fat Controller acts as a source of objective morality for the trains. For situations in the real world, this is fine, because most adults that a child interacts with will have been socialized in similar situations, and therefore their sense of morality is similar enough that there is consistency throughout a child's day-to-day life. Some people continue to believe in moral objectivity as they grow up, and they shift their authority figure from a parent or guardian to a higher power like a religious god or a cosmic order. But as children age, they begin to see the nuance in morality via context, situation, or viewpoint. This is one reason why I think children's cartoons begin to look boring or silly to older children, because there's little room for exploration of the self within worlds that are so structured. All children begin to question authority figures to some level, and so they begin playing with the idea of moral subjectivity, and what is right and wrong is due to socialization and various other factors that I'm not going to get into right now. This process will actually continue right up into their teen years, so it's not as though a child will one day wake up and realize their concept of morality has shifted or was wrong. That would be very strange. The objective morality imposed by authority figures in children's shows and media is why the communities within the show, like the island of Sodor and Thomas and Friends, seem so bizarre when placed under scrutiny. I think most adults would agree that the real world is not that simple, and that authority figures like Sir Topham Hatt are actually really problematic in real life. And there's no such thing as actual benevolent parental entities that Western preschool media often shows. And as children move to new and more complex shows over their whole childhood, they begin to see that although we tend to agree about what is right and wrong in society, morality can look very different depending on what side of a situation you find yourself on. I remember the first time I really thought about how much perspective changes what appears to be right and wrong, and it was because a children's TV show pointed it out to me. It's one of the core themes behind the third generation of Digimon Tamers, and it really rocked my perception of morality, and this was just an older children's show that I naturally graduated to as I learned more about social mores. Because of the structured nature of how preschool children are taught morality and socialization in schools in the West, it follows that the media made for Western children would be presented in a similar fashion. These shows present the viewer with an authority figure for other characters to take their morality from, in the same way that a child would understand a parental figure. This moral objectivity helps the child navigate the world until they're old enough or intellectually capable enough of grappling with the idea that there probably is no universal right or wrong. There's only how we treat one another. But until then, these children and their parents can immerse themselves in a perfectly structured, if bizarre, moralistically objective world that is expertly crafted to help kinder-aged kids become socialized and integrated individuals. And if you're an adult, you can always get nostalgic for beloved childhood characters and dive into the stories from your past that help socialize you into the person you are now, thanks to the familiar characters that shaped you. For better or for worse. And that is why I think Thomas the Tank Engine, but really children's shows in general, are actually pretty interesting vehicles for teaching morality to children. Here are my stray thoughts. Most of what I'm referring to in terms of socialization is in regards to Western culture. I think I was pretty clear about that, but it's good to emphasize it. As fun as the Marxist reading of Thomas the Tank Engine is, I do think it's a bad faith reading, and it's not the way the show is meant to be read. That being said, there's no right or wrong way to read art. I am someone who still loves Thomas the Tank Engine, and I did go back and rewatch a lot of the early seasons when I found out it was going to be canceled. And even though this makes me really, really sad, I am glad to know that the show will carry on in a new form, even if they did change the theme song. And now it's for sure stuck in your head. Hey, thanks so much for watching that video. Don't forget to subscribe and toot that like button. I was actually surprised at how much genuine joy I got out of rewatching some of the early seasons of Thomas the Tank Engine. If you enjoyed that and want to hear more conversations, check out our podcast channel called the Cinemasters. And don't forget to stick around here for more episodes of This Is a Thing and the long and the short of it, as well as whatever else we got going on right here on Cinemasters Ultimate Timeline.